The next thing we need to look at before we start modeling in Maya is scale. Scale is simply the size of objects. And it's easy to fall into a trap of not paying attention to scale. And I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've seen many students fall into this trap of they just start working, they start building stuff, and they get, really into it, and they make all this complicated stuff, and maybe they made a character rig that's got all kinds of controls on it, and it's really cool, and it works great. But they forgot to pay attention to scale at the very beginning of the process. You have to establish your scale convention before you even think about building something. And if you don't, you're going to have serious issues. Like, for example, you could build a character rig that can't be scaled, and your character is built at some wacky size, and then you try to put your character into an environment, and it's the wrong size, and you're stuck. You can't scale the character because it's got this crazy rig on it, and so then you have to scale your environment to fit the character, and that's crazy talk. Or, for example, you're doing game development, and the game engine requires that you build your scene at a very particular scale, and then you're not paying attention to that, and you build all your assets, and they're all at different sizes, and it's just crazy making. You have to then rescale everything and try to get it to fit, and it's a huge waste of time. You don't want to have this happen to you. You want to just get it right the first time. Before you start building anything, you need to figure out what scale you're going to adopt, and then set your units accordingly, and set up your grid accordingly too, so that you'll know at a glance what size things are just by looking at the grid. In Maya, generally speaking, you have really, just enough rope to hang yourself, because in Maya, scale is kind of messed up relative to other programs. For example, if you're in 3ds Max, you basically build everything at 1-to-1 scale. If you make a character, that character is going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 meters in height, and everything's fine. And you can build your whole world at unity scale or at 1-to-1 scale. But in Maya, it's more complicated, because Maya really, there were some major issues in how Maya was originally designed. It was a unitless system to begin with when it was first created way back in the Dark Ages. So back then, they didn't even think of this. I know that sounds crazy, but the Maya developers had some huge cognitive blind spot when it was first created, and they didn't have scale. There was no scale in Maya. So every person in the universe got to decide what their scale was in Maya. And so then scale was finally bolted onto Maya much later, years later, and it was done in kind of a messed up way. So you're going to have issues with scale in Maya. Just be prepared for that. Building things at 1-to-1 scale is an option, but actually studios tend to build things at miniature scale, because then you'll have fewer issues. So if you build something at 1-to-1 scale, you're basically saying that a person is 170 centimeters tall. But a lot of times in Maya, you have to build at a 1/10th scale, or even a 1/100th scale, especially if you're using dynamics, like physics engines, kind of force you to use a 1/100th scale. So instead of building your character to be 170 centimeters tall, you build them to be 1.7 centimeters tall, a tiny itty-bitty little scale model. And this is common standard practice in Maya. So just be aware there's a whole, host of headaches that come up with scale in Maya. I'm going to try to cut through that in this lesson and just build a simple object at unity scale, at 1-to-1 scale. To change your units, you go into the Preferences. Window, Settings Preferences, Preferences, Settings, and you've got Working Units. And you'll see linear working units are defaulted to centimeter. And take a look at the grid here. Okay, I'll just move this over a little bit so you can see there's my grid. We can change our working unit to something else like inch. And the grid got larger. Each one of these squares on the grid represents 1 unit currently. And the units are controlled through this setting. If I choose millimeter, then my grid gets tiny. If I choose meter, then my grid gets ginormous. Each one of those squares is now a meter. Notice that these boxes did not change size. The size of objects is absolute, but we're just choosing a different measuring system to measure those objects. And if I select one of those boxes and go into its inputs here, we can see, for example, that this cube's height is 0.15 meters. But if I change it to centimeter, it's going to read out as 15. 15 centimeters equals 0.15 meters. Okay, Actually, in this particular example, I want to use inches because my wine glass is actually about 8 inches tall. So that I don't have to do any conversions. I'll just choose inch over here. And that's all there is to that. Now, each one of these squares is 1 inch in size. Okay, cool. Now, I want to warn you about this preferences dialog, and this is going to make you crazy. When you click save here, all these settings are stored for the next scene that you open. So the next time you come and make a new scene in Maya, all the settings that you do in here will be red, and your scene will be built according to those preferences. But there's one major exception to that, and that's this page. The working units are not persistent. They're not sticky. This is the crazy exception, okay? In this one window here, when you make this change, that's only for the currently open scene. All right, so we can click save here, but ironically, we're not saving anything in the preferences when we do this. All I've done is change the current scene's working units to inch. And if I make a new scene, if I go up here to File, New Scene, and I don't bother saving this, go back into Window, Settings, Preferences, Preferences, back to Settings, and we're back at centimeters. So don't let this make your head explode. It's not a bug, it's just a weird feature. It's just poor design here. There's a separate window for the working units of subsequent scenes. So when you make a new scene, there's a whole other window for that. Okay, so let's look at that. Cancel out of here. And I can go into the File menu and New Scene, and you'll see in the menu, a lot of these menu items have little boxes next to them. The little box is the options dialog for that particular command or tool. I'm going to go to New Scene and click on the little square, and that opens up the New Scene options. These are the options for the next scene that I make. Okay, so if I chose meter here and click New, and I'm not saving, and then go into Window, Settings, Preferences, Preferences again, go back into Settings, now we're at meters because I told Maya for the next new scene, I want you to choose meters. All right, bomb out of here. Go back into there, Maya, New Scene, Options, and if you want the preferences dialog to be consistent, if you want the preferences to be actual preferences for the current scene and all new scenes, then what you'll do is you'll flip this switch that says, do not reset working units. And this is really poorly worded, but what they mean to say here is, make the preferences dialog act the way it normally should. So that when you change it in the preferences, it will change the working units for the current scene and all subsequent scenes from now on. Alrighty, so I can click apply here, don't save. Alright, I can close out of here. And then when I go to Window, Settings, Preferences, Preferences, go back into Settings, change it to inches, click Save, and now it's actually being stored. That inch setting is going to be viable for all new scenes. So when I go back up to File, New Scene, and go back into Window, Settings, Preferences, and go to Settings, now it says inch. So I do recommend that you do that. Go into that New Scene Options dialog and flip that switch, do not reset working units, and then from then on this Preferences dialog will actually make sense. Okay, I know that's crazy. It only took me about 12 years to figure out what was going on there. All right, now we come to the grid. If I work in inches, then it might not be a bad idea for me to set it up in feet and inches, so that if I look at the grid, I can tell, what size something is just by looking at it. All right, so let's go into the grid. And that's going to be in the Display menu. Display Grid Options. All right, and we've got the length and width. That's the size of the grid from the center to edge here in this perspective window. So I could change that. I could set this to, let's say, 25 and click Apply. And now it's extended out 25 units, or in this case, 25 inches from center to edge. Then we have a grid line every 5 units, or every 5 inches, but it's also being subdivided here. We're getting a major grid line every 5 inches, and a minor grid line every 5 divided by 5 inches. But we can't see the difference between the grid lines and the subdivisions because they're the same color down here. I'm going to change the grid line color to a little bit darker. So I'm going to just move this slider over one notch and click apply. And now we can see that the darker lines are every 5 units, and the lighter lines are every 5 divided by 5, or every 1 unit. Okay, so if I wanted to do this in true imperial units, what I would do is I would say, give me a grid line every 12 inches, and then subdivide that by 12, and click apply. And now I've got a major grid line every foot, or 12 inches, and a minor grid line or subdivision line every 12 divided by 12 inches, or every 1 inch. Additionally, if you want to, open this up a little bit, we can display grid numbers. So if I click perspective grid numbers on axes and press apply, now I see that's 12 inches or 24 inches away from center. We also have the orthographic grid, and that's the views that are the 2D views, and we can turn that on here as well. Click apply and close. And if I want to see those orthographic views, what you do is you just hover your mouse over a viewport and tap the spacebar really quickly. And now you go to a 4 viewport layout. We have our 3D perspective view here, and then we have 2D orthographic views, top, front, and side. All right, so those are the orthographic views. And if we want to go back to a single view, just hover the mouse over that view and tap the spacebar once again, and you'll go back to a single viewport. You'll notice that when I did that, something flashed on the screen. If you hold the spacebar down, you get what's called the hotbox, and that's just an alternate method of accessing the Maya menus. We don't really need the hotbox because it's redundant. So don't let that throw you off. If you hold down the spacebar, you get the hotbox. If you just tap it really quickly, you'll swap to a different viewport layout. I can go over to the front view here and tap the spacebar and maximize that. Tap it again and go back to the 4 viewport layout.